So you and Senator Kelly are the only Democrats that have actually come to the border, and I appreciate you being here.
I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you.
Grateful to you.
Thank you.
Sure we go.
Let's go.
The next President of the United States, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Thank you all for coming out today, and thanks to all the other people, Jimmy, and the other people who put this amazing film together. There's a lot of politicians throughout throughout our history that have talked about the border issue as a way to stir up or to encourage or incite xenophobia or racism or nationalism or all the other kind of alchemies of demagoguery. And I come to this issue from a different place, from a different perspective. And it's a perspective of compassion, of humanitarianism, but also just common sense. A country cannot exist if it can't secure its borders anymore. Any more than a cell can exist if it doesn't have a coherent membrane. The kind of everything, the borders are one of the definitions of our country. And we need to close them. And as the Border Patrolman, who was the former president of the Border Patrol Union and the head of the Border Patrol in that area, he said we need high fences, but we need open gates. We need to change our immigration policy to make it coherent, to make it sensible, to make it serve the interests of our country. Right now, it took me, when I went to the border, it took me 3 days to really comprehend what was happening there, because it was so strange. And you heard me do the interview with the woman who ran the healthcare center, where she said, and when people come across, many of them do not have the money. They've been stripped of their money by the cartels. One of the things that immigrants do is they get robbed, they get exploited, they get extorted, they get raped, they get robbed. All of these, we saw people who talked about kidnapping, which is endemic on the border, sex trafficking, child sex trafficking, the smuggling of all these drugs, the methamphetamine and the fentanyl that's coming across, and then the destruction, this assault on the local community where people told us that they wouldn't let their children out during the daytime because they couldn't go play in the yard because they were scared of these strangers that were running across their yard, fleeing from the Border Patrol, which is a very common occurrence there. We visited a hospital, the local hospital. The local people in Yuma were, as I said, they were the representative of the best in our country. The local hospital told us, the director of the hospital, that that hospital had lost $27 million the previous year in unreimbursed expenses caring for migrants. And they cared for migrants. They let migrants come into the emergency room or into the maternity ward at the same basis that they did local people. So relative, the wife of the head of the hospital had scheduled an inducement for her pregnancy, to end her pregnancy, I think it was a C-section, and could not get in because there were 35 immigrant mothers who had filled up the maternity ward. And we saw this all over the city of Yuma, where people were going going out of their way to care for the immigrants with compassion. But the community itself is under assault, and this is now happening in communities all across our country. This week, the New York Times had an article that said that 90,000 immigrants had landed in New York from this giant flow of 7 million immigrants over the past 3 years that have come across illegally. 7 million. Compare that to the 3.1 million who entered legally during that period. So twice the amount of immigration is coming across illegally. And we are not managing as a nation our own borders. We have shot that function out to the Mexican drug cartels. We're making billions of dollars controlling U.S. immigration policy. And all of the carefully constructed immigration policy that we had in our country is meaningless because drug cartels are deciding who gets in and who doesn't. The immigrants and the New York Times article talked about how this tsunami of new immigrants, 90,000 people, were crushing the social service systems in New York City. Bloomberg carried a recent article that talked about how officials in New York City are now considering turning Central Park into an open-air migrant facility or migrant camp. So this is the level of crisis, and we talk to people. I did a tour of Cleveland and Harlem in the last couple of weeks. Some of the Lee Harvard neighborhood in Cleveland, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods, and the black-owned business owners and local people were talking about how they could no longer access the Social Security service or the social services of their city because they were overwhelmed by migrants. The city of Miami has done probably the best job in our country of reducing homelessness over the past 30 years. They have a model program that's worked. They've reduced homelessness from 7,000 people to 1,000. But now, all of that progress is being reversed by the flood of immigrants that is pouring into Miami. And then what happens to these people? Those 7 million people who have come here now, there's 16 million altogether. That's 7 million in the last 3 years. What happens to them when they get into this country? Because this is supposed to be, many people in my political party believe that we've adopted this to reverse the cruelty of the Trump years and to have a humanitarian policy that is welcome to immigrants. But what happens to these immigrants once they cross that border and they engage, they endure all of the abuse and the rapes and the sex trafficking and the kidnapping of their children and the robberies? We talked to Peruvian families that their life savings was removed from them just before they cross the border. So they go through that, and then what happens to them when they come into this country? They are still liable for labor exploitation. That's their lives. They are now illegal. There is no way that they can legally work in this country. They cannot support themselves. They cannot pay taxes. Everything they do, we're creating this understory of exploitable poor that will be exploited and will impact the price of labor and the wage of labor for every other American, every working American. But these people are being paid by unscrupulous employers $5 or $6 an hour, and that's their lives here now. And there's no way they can change that. They have no leverage. They have no bargaining power. And I spent a lot of my lifetime interacting with Cesar Chavez, who was, one of my father's close political allies, and then became a very, very close ally of mine on the pesticide issue. The last 20 years of his life, he became the primary actor in this country, one of the primary activists against farm pesticides, agricultural pesticides. And I worked with him very closely on those issues, and I was a pallbearer for him when he died in 1993. Cesar Chavez was one of the biggest champions in our country, probably the lead champion at that time, for a closed border, because he knew that American farm workers could not make any gains in terms of their wages, their benefits, their quality of life, if there was an endless supply of new workers, undocumented, coming across the border who lacked the bargaining power to be able to ask for higher wages from their employers. Because the employers could always use the threat of exposing them. We have a policy now that is not serving anybody's interest. It's not serving the interests of Democrats or Republicans. It's not serving the interests of our country, clearly. It's not serving the interests of the migrants. And it's not serving the interests of our neighbors to the south. Everybody is getting hurt by this policy. The good news is that it's solvable, that we can stop this. And, I will say this, that I was against Trump's wall. I thought it was a crazy idea. To me, it was a big mistake. My sister did a prize-winning documentary called The Wall, showing all the reasons we shouldn't build it. And I don't think we do need a wall, as we were told, that 2,200 miles between Brownsville and San Diego. But we need something. And a lot of that technology was in place. We have the towers, we saw them. Some of those towers were removed, which is incomprehensible to me. We had the cameras, we had the videos, we had the lights, we had the ground sensors, the motion detectors. We can protect our borders. We have the capacity, the technological capacity to do that. We need the willpower, the political willpower to do that, and we need the personnel, and we need to do that for our country. We need, number one, we need to restore those barriers. And again, they don't all have to be physical barriers. We need some barriers so that we know everybody who's crossing. We know every single person who's crossing. We can do that. And we can then, if we have the personnel, we can stop that. More importantly, we need to be able to process legal asylum seekers. The one category that comes across the border undocumented are people who are fleeing political persecution. And we have a capacity, we have a methodology for processing those claims. What we should be doing, and what we used to do, is we would process them at the border. And only 15% of them are adjudicated as legitimate. The rest of the other 85% are adjudicated as specious. And then under normal conditions, the specious claimants are not allowed into this country. They're turned away. If we were doing that today, the entire business model for the cartels would collapse. Because these immigrants who are coming into it, and let me tell you, first, what happens to the immigrants now is most of the immigrants we saw that evening, none of them were even, only 2 families said they were fleeing political persecution. The rest of us just told us openly, we're coming here to make money. We're coming here for a better life. So they didn't even have that claim. And those immigrants shouldn't be allowed into the country. We should stop that at the border. It's the reason you want it. But what happens is that they're all given court dates. And the first court date is an arraignment. It's an arraignment in front of the immigration court. Because we don't have enough judges, it's then a 7-year wait to get a hearing. So those immigrants are allowed into the country. They attend the first hearing, and then they legally go and wait for 7 years. They can't work, but they're in our country legally, and they put down roots. And we don't really know. They become part of this underground economy. And what we should be doing, and the reason we have that is we don't have enough immigration judges. We don't have the capacity to process those claims. And we need to do that, and we need to do it quickly. We need to be able to process them at the border and make a judgment right there. And the people who do not have legitimate asylum claims should not be allowed in, should not be allowed to cross. As soon as we do that, the immigration is going to stop. Because if you put yourself into their shoes, and we talked, at length with these migrants, these are people who have clearly spent years and years thinking about doing this. This is a huge decision. It's the most important decision in the lives of these people. They're deciding to root themselves up, to leave their families, to leave their jobs, their income.
Your vision and your passion on how you will fix the border crisis when elected President of the United States of America. So we have microphones on either side, and just for members of the press, please. And if you can please keep your questions to one question and also to what today is about, which is our border policy that was released today and the film. Who has a question?
Hi, Mr. Kennedy. My name is Jackie Gergenti, and I am with the Los Angeles Hispanic Republican Club radio show on AM 870, The Answer. It is a pleasure to be here, and I have one question for you. We have 85,000 missing children. We don't know where they are. Under your new administration, what will you do and how will you go about finding these children?
Well, I don't know how to answer that question. It will be a priority. I mean, my whole life has been about protecting children. And this is these stories that I heard on the border, and I know that number, are almost, are things that I emotionally find it difficult to even process, that these children are missing, that nobody knows where they are. And, it's hard to even imagine what their fates might be. So it's going to be a priority for me. I do not know how we start going about that, but that will be a priority for me.
Well, thank you for changing your mind on the wall.
Craig Pastor-Jardula, independent media journalist. According to U.S. Customs and Border Protections, 87% of the migrants that are coming to the border are still coming from Latin America. Why? Because the U.S. foreign policy has over 80 bases in Latin America. NGOs that pollute these areas, funding murder death squads to overturn these countries. You said so yourself, what happens in Guatemala is compared to Costa Rica. Why is there so much attention paid to what happens at the border instead of looking at the cause of migration, which is U.S. foreign policy? And also, too, as well, Mr. Kennedy, I think you know that the cartels, we learned this from Iran-Contra, are run by the CIA. So if we want to take care of the cartels, shouldn't we be looking to Langley rather than Mexico? Thank you.
That's one of the issues that I've been very outspoken about from the beginning. That we do need to take responsibility in our country for a foreign policy that has supported death squads in Salvador and Guatemala and Nicaragua for many years, that has supported military juntas, that has punished political leaders in those countries, in the countries of Latin America and Central America, when they try to initiate reforms, land reforms, education reforms, reforms that will empower the poor, and that will create that will try to give the poor in those countries a leg up into the middle class. we should be encouraging those policies. That's why my uncle understood that. And that's why he changed U.S. policy from supporting the most violent dictators in Latin America and Central America to supporting instead the Alliance for Progress, the USAID program before it became a CIA fund, and the Kennedy Milk program and nutrition programs for the poor, but also withholding aid from those countries unless they did land reform, unless they did, medical improvements, education reform to the poor. That's what we ought to be doing in those countries. Instead, we continue to fund the death squads. We continue to encourage these austerity programs. The large buildup of debt. Benefits go to the super rich oligarchs, and then the poor pay for the debt over generations. And when the country is essentially bankrupt, we encourage and implement these austerity programs that further disempower and dispossess and alienate the poor. And a lot of the problems that drive people to come to the border are the direct outcomes of those U.S. policies. So I've been thinking about those policies all my life. I've been to virtually every country in Latin America and Central America, beginning when I was very young. I've lived in Peru. I've lived in Colombia. I've seen the outcome of those policies. I've told this story before that when my uncle had the two favorite trips that he made when he was president. The first was his trip to Ireland. And that was a very, very emotional trip for him and for the Irish people. And when he left from Shannon Airport in the spring of 1963, his last words to Ireland was that he would return in the springtime, which of course he was not able to do. But the other favorite trip that he made was to Colombia. And he met the leader of Colombia, Yedis Camargo, who was a populist leader, who my Aunt Jackie said was the most brilliant of all the heads of state that she and Jack met when they were in the White House. And they had met people like de Gaulle and Eamon de Valera, who was the liberator of Ireland and the George Washington of Ireland, a very impressive man. But she said none of them matched Yedis Camargo. And 2.5 million people flooded into the central square in Bogota and to greet my uncle with this incredible emotional outpouring. And Yedis Camargo turned to my uncle and he said, "Do you know why they love you?" And my uncle said, "No." And he said, "Because they think that you've put America on the side of the poor. And to me, that's where America ought to be. It ought to be on the side." Excuse me?
The follow-up is, are you committed to closing some of those bases that we are occupying land in Latin America?
Absolutely. Those will be some of the first bases that there are 800 bases around. And not doing us any good. We think that this is our relationship with Latin America. We can control them from the bases. Well, guess what? China doesn't have any bases there. And the primary creditor today in virtually every Latin American country is China. The business is being done by China. The engineers are being sent over are Chinese engineers. The roads are being constructed. The universities, the ports, by China, not the United States. The relationship and the friendship is with China. Brazil is switching to the Chinese currency. Those bases have not helped U.S. security. They have not helped our business. We don't have engineers anymore that can design the roads or build bridges or build ports. Rice University used to graduate 20% of the engineers in the world. Now it graduates less than 1%. The engineers are coming from China. And that's good for China because they can build things and they can make deals and they can do business. They made the decision to project economic power abroad, which is what my uncle did. He never sent a combat troop to die abroad. He was projecting economic power, and that's why throughout Latin America and Africa, there are more boulevards named after him, more avenues, more statues to him, more universities and hospitals named after him than any other president. And that is the strength of the real strength of a nation. When people around you want to be your friend, and you don't need to put bases in their country to ensure their friendship, and it's not winning this friendship. It's all it's doing is bankrupting the middle class in this country, and I'm going to change that.
Mr. Kennedy, my name is Marion McKeown. I'm a reporter with the Sunday Business Post on BBC Radio. I would like to ask you specifically, and if you could be specific, I'd really appreciate it. You speak about increasing border security, but I've been covering the border for quite a while. I spoke with one Sister Norma Pimetta, who works in McAllen, and she said that these migrants who are coming, that it is like fleeing a burning building for them. She was specifically talking about women and children who are fleeing gang violence, domestic violence, poverty, the farms that produce nothing because of climate change. And she said it doesn't matter how many borders you put up or how high, that they will keep coming because it's a choice. They know what they're coming to. They know they risk death, that they risk rape, that they risk horrific journeys through the desert, but it's still better than what they're leaving behind. So how would you address that?
Well, I would address it the way, I think the person that you talk to is probably underestimating the role of U.S. foreign policy in fueling the destabilization of those countries and those economies that is amplifying the poverty and amplifying all those reasons to leave. I also would say this to you, the evening that we were there, we saw, I think, about 300 people come across, and only 2 of them were from Latin America, and nobody from Central America. So, and that may not represent what is typical. We found one Colombian family and one Peruvian family. But everybody else was from West Africa. They were from Europe, Eastern Europe, and they were from Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Tibet, Nepal, and China. So that, I think that may, what you're talking about is an older model. And, I've made this point before. There are very few people from Costa Rica coming across that border. And why is that? Costa Rica is the only country in Latin America that we've never invaded. Guatemala has never recovered from our 1953 overthrow of Jacob Arbenz, who was the most democratic leader in Latin America, but tried to nationalize the United Fruit Company to its land with payments to them. And the CIA, Alan Dulles at that time, before he was CIA director, had been the lawyer for United Fruit. And they had direct access to him. And they were able to initiate a U.S. coup against this guy who was Arbenz was the model of democracy in the hemisphere. We should have been supporting him. And the same thing is true in Nicaragua and El Salvador. We pumped, billions of dollars into funding death squads in those countries. And a lot of the terror and a lot of the poverty and a lot of the destabilization and a lot of the oppression. We basically financed a genocide against the Mosquito Indians in Nicaragua and El Salvador. We financed again and again some of the worst slaughters in the history of Latin America during the 80s and early 90s. So I understand that if you're standing at the border, you're seeing people who are impoverished coming across from Central America and Latin America and thinking there's nothing that we can do about poverty. But I think our policies create all the poverty in Latin America, but they have amplified the poverty and amplified the desperation of the people and restricted and fueled political oppression, deliberately and purposefully, the kind of oppression that people legitimately are fleeing.
Mr. Kennedy, my name is Ed Rampell. I'm with the Hollywood Progressive. And I have two questions. Just real quick question. Last night at Turner Classic Movies, I saw a movie that made me think of your family called Winter Kills. I'm wondering if you have any comment on that film, if you've ever seen that movie starring Jeff Bridges.
I have not. I'm sorry.
I recommend you see it. The other main question I have is that it seems today from your presentation that you're making border issues and migration a cornerstone of your campaign, which was in some ways similar to what Trump did in 2016. And there's been rumors bandied about in the media that you may end up running on a ticket with Donald Trump as his vice president. So what is your response to those rumors? And can you definitively say you will never run on a ticket for the White House with Donald Trump?
Yeah, in my experience, a lot of the stuff that you read in the mainstream news, the corporate news, is what I would call conspiracy theories. Dealing with an entire industry made up of conspiracy theorists. And in direct answer to your question, no, I will not be Donald Trump's vice president.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, Mr. Robert Kennedy Jr. My name is Gina Felix Goldman. I'm a journalist from Mexico. I went to the San Fernando Valley as a journalist, and I asked everybody, a lot of people, what question would you ask the former president of the United States, which is Donald Trump, and what would you ask the future president of the United States? And I told them that I was going to be here, and a lot of them are not able to be here because the majority in Pacoima, the San Fernando Valley, it's a low-income neighborhood, and they're working, they're cleaning homes, and some of them are even outside in the street working with the jackhammers. And they want to know, when will you be having an opportunity to come and visit Pacoima, the San Fernando Valley, Sun Valley, Granada Hills, and the neighborhood where you really do have hard-working Latinos. There's a large percentage of Mexicans, large percentage of people from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and when you meet the president of Mexico, what kind of conversation will that take place regarding the border?
So let me answer those questions. And let me actually start by adding an addendum to the previous question, which started out with the previous questioner started out with the observation that this was a kind of, the border is a kind of Trump issue. And what I would say is this should not be a partisan issue. I don't think it would be if people could see what I saw. I went down to the border feeling that Trump had made a mistake on the wall. But, I feel like people need to be able to recalibrate their worldview when they're confronted with evidence. And the Republican Party. And when I'm president, what I'm going to do is bring in Republicans and Democrats and get the best Republican ideas and the best Democratic ideas and put everything on the table. avoid the kind of ideological pettiness that has been so damaging to our country. And I think that, what we're seeing on the border today is the outcome of that, and is the outcome of a lot of it, of political pettiness, rather than, really, rather than a comprehensive and thoughtful analysis of what we ought to be doing in respect to promoting the best values of our country and the best outcome for every American and for everybody else. And that's what we ought to be looking at it, and not brand it Republican issue or Democratic issue, but just say, let's deal with this. It's an existential threat to our country, and it's not good for the 16 million illegals who are now living here and cannot legally get a job and cannot defend themselves. It's not good for the working people in this country, in the San Fernando Valley and elsewhere, who are now competing in their wages with people who can be paid $5 and $6 an hour because they don't have the political power to defend themselves and demand a higher wage. It shouldn't be a Republican issue. It shouldn't be a Democratic issue. There is no such thing as Republican children or Democratic children. We're all American, and we need to. My father spent a lot of time in the San Fernando Valley, and I've been in the San Fernando Valley and in most of the big towns that you mentioned, and I can't wait to go back there. My father told us when we were little, he would take us to places like the Mississippi Delta, and he would take us to Bed-Stuy Restoration, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods in New York, or to Harlem or Southeast Washington, or to Delano to visit Cesar Chavez, or to Eastern Kentucky, Western West Virginia, where the poorest Americans were. And he would always tell us, he would say, the big shots in this country, the big corporations, the big millionaires, they have plenty of people to help them. They have lobbyists, they have attorneys, they have PR firms, and they own the politicians who can protect their interests. And he said, those people don't need the Kennedys. The people who need the Kennedys are the people that you're talking about. Those are and they don't have the representation and the power in our political process. So those are the people that I want to represent as president, and I know the desperation. I haven't been recently to the San Fernando Valley, but I've been to a lot of places in this country that look like it, including Eastern Ohio, and Western Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, and Cleveland, Ohio, and many, many other places. And I've seen the desperation that the working people in this country are dealing with. We're living in a country today where 57% of Americans could not put their hands on $1,000 if they had an emergency in their family. We're living in a country where 35% of Americans do not make enough money to meet basic human needs, which is food, transportation, and shelter. The average income in this country for Americans is $5,000 less than the money it takes to survive. So how are people making up for basic necessities, $5,000 less than what is needed for basic necessities? And I've watched people, in Yuma, in the food banks and in the grocery stores, change the recipes for their food so that they can make it through the grocery line. I've seen one of my best friends just lost his food stamps that got cut from $283 a month to $23 a month. And you can't live on that. And he sent me a text last night saying, I'm eating one meal a day. It's the only way I can survive. And there's so many Americans, and how are they funding that gap? That $5,000 gap, they're funding it with credit card bills. They're putting it on their credit cards to survive. And try to imagine a good end to that. They're paying 22% on average in their credit card bills. If the mafia did that to you, it would be called loan sharking. For the banks, it's just business as usual. And Americans have the highest credit card debt that we've ever had. I think $1.3 trillion now, and $330 billion were added in during the Biden and Trump administration. The highest, with the same policies in both administrations, the same economic policies that people are now, both President Trump and President Biden are running based upon those economic policies that have completely failed the middle class in this country. So if they win, we can expect more of the same. But because people are funding their lives on credit card bills now, they have to make tough choices.
One more question. And then afterward, we have a really important announcement, so please stay seated.
My name is Alberto Godinez. Mr. Kennedy, it's an honor to be here, and I'm immigrant, proud to be an American. My question, after today, I will change party and support Kennedy 20.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to the media for being here. I now would like to introduce our campaign manager for Team Kennedy, Congressman Dennis Kucinich.
Hello, Los Angeles.
Hello! Welcome!
You just heard from the next president of the United States. Yay! What do you think about our new border policy? In order to be able to get the message out to the people of Los Angeles County and the entire state of California, we're beginning tonight at Art Lounge, La Brea, and Beverly Boulevard, between 7 and 9, our first canvassing training session. And you're all invited, because we're going to go door to door across Los Angeles County and this city and get the message out about a whole new direction for America as a result of us coming together to elect Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the next president. So thank you. Say that those of us who have had the pleasure of working with this organization, I want to thank Stephanie Spear for her efforts in helping to build this, but the people who worked on this 19-minute film, Bob, Sharon Jimenez, Robert Campos, Del Bigtree, Jimmy, there's a whole group of people who came together in order to make this moment possible, and I'm going to ask all of you to join me in giving them a great round of applause for the job well done. So, Kennedy24.com, send your friends and family there. We're organizing this country to take it back for all the people. Thank you very much.